This video is brought to you by PolarisInvesting.com, a site for creating defensible valuations. Called business valuation is based on expectations derived from skillful consideration of past facts and future possibilities. In this video, we will be discussing the Polaris template spreadsheet, primarily the VBA code that's behind this in these mainly two modules, Module 1 and Module 2. This template spreadsheet is the same spreadsheet that was used to develop 3 applications that are available for free from the PolarisInvesting.com website, namely the Analyzer app, the Portfolio Return app, and the Valuation app. And that's what they look like when you bring them up. But they all started off with the template spreadsheet. This video is a brief review of videos contained in the Polaris Investing YouTube channel in the playlist Data Access Database Code Review. The playlist is located here at the bottom of the channel. The target audience for this video is someone who's been through the detailed videos and possibly even developed an application with the template before, but now has come back and needs a refresher on the contents of those videos. In this video, we'll be going through the quick reference guide located in a notepad file called template quick reference. Quick reference guide summarizes functions used in manipulating data. It is broken up into 3 main sections. The first section discusses Excel built-in functions. The second section discusses Polaris provided functions. The third section discusses SQL statements. The Excel built-in functions is further divided into Excel functions and then built-in VBA functions. The Polaris functions are broken up into general functions, timing functions, and then functions that are specific to pulling stock data from different sources. And then we're going to end up with just talking a little bit about how to do tracing using the tracing functions. The section on SQL statements is divided up into talking about data definition statements, data manipulation statements, and then some other topics. Starting off here, we're going to talk about the Excel built-in functions. And if you want more detail than what we're going to briefly discuss here, you want to go back and look at the Excel cell reference video, the Excel functions video, and the Excel techniques video. So as a refresher, volatile functions, now today, the info, indirect, offset, cell, and rand. You want to be careful about using those because they any cell that references those functions and any downstream cells that reference those previous cells will all be recalculated on every recalculation. So want to be careful using those. For looking up data, these are the functions that you typically use: index, match, and XLookup. We'll talk more about those here in a little bit. Trimming, trimmed from both sides or trimmed from the left or the right. Give so many characters to the left or the right. Uppercase, lowercase, length. The mid function extracts a substring starting at a specified location and for a specified number of characters. Character, text, which is really a format, and then a way to concatenate, either with the word concatenate or use ampersand. And these functions do the count blank, count A, which is really non-blanks, but there's some issues with that really should avoid using count A. We'll talk about another way to count besides using count A. Count if, count ifs. You got search within a string, find within a string. These are similar, but they have different parameters. Replace within a string. There is the substitute function, which is quite useful because you can substitute a specific instance of a substring. So let's say you want to substitute a particular instance of the letter A. You could say the third instance or the fifth instance. All right, check to see if value is a number, and then the if-error function. Mod, integer, and round. There are some issues with those functions when negative parameters are used. I suggest you watch the Excel functions video for more information. Then SumIfs and SumProduct, but really SumProduct should be called SumOperations, because you, instead of putting each parameter of SumProducts separated by a comma, you can just use the default is multiplication is assumed if you separate the different parameters, but if you don't use separate parameters and just simply use the other arithmetic operations like divide, add, minus, whatever, you can just enter one parameter. It becomes very versatile in terms of not just being a product, but a sum of whatever operation you specify. And then talking about choose can be used to comment your code, because you can choose the first parameter is the actual calculation, and then the second parameter put a text string that describes what the first parameter is actually doing. Since this video was originally recorded, Excel's come out with two additional functions that help with the readability of formulas, namely the let and lambda functions. To better understand how these functions work, going to look at them in a simple use case, and then look at them again in a more involved case. For both the simple and involved use cases, we'll write a formula three different ways. First is the traditional inline formula. Second is using the let function. And the third is using the lambda function. So this first inline function for the simple use case takes an input parameter, which is an A1, and adds 10 to it. And next going to use the let function, and you can see up here in the formula bar that it's defined to have an input parameter A1, and then the calculation is the input plus 10. So you've given a name to the input parameter, plus it makes it clear what's an input and how that input is used in the formula calculation. Next, going to rewrite the formula using the lambda function. And you'll notice the lambda function has a similar format to the let function. Function name, and then the name of an input parameter, and then calculation that uses that named input parameter. But what's different from the let function is instead of putting the input parameter next to the named input parameter, you put it after the function, namely here A1, which is the traditional way to call a function. But as the comment states, putting the lambda function in a cell is primarily intended for testing of the lambda function before it's declared in the name manager. And that's what's done over here, is now you see that when you call that lambda function, you call it with a name, in this case add it, and you pass in the input parameter A1. And we go up here to the name manager, and you see that the name added has the lambda function defined there. In this simple use case, the let and lambda function have marginal value. Using them for more involved formulas show their full value. An example of a more involved formula is shown here that calculates income tax for a specific year. Without going through the details of it, you can see that there's a fair number of values involved, and it's really unclear what is an input value and what's just a kind of a configuration value used in the formula. Next, let's look at the formula rewritten using the let command. And with new lines inserted, it's much clearer what's going on. The let defines an input parameter called the AGI, which is the adjusted gross income for 2026. The value is obtained from cell A6. And then it defines a bunch of configuration parameters that really recreate the tax brackets for 2026, namely the rate and the threshold values for each rate. Next, let's test a lambda function for the formula. And like we saw in the simple use case, it's very similar to the let function. It's just that these values are parameters to the function call. Next, going to deploy that lambda function by going up to the name manager and creating a name called income tax and referring to the lambda function here. Now let's call income tax with new lines inserted. You can see fairly straightforward what's going on. I have a function income tax, an input parameter, A6, which is the adjusted gross income, and then we got configuration value for the tax year 2026. For income taxes, the tax brackets and sometimes the tax thresholds change year to year. By using the function income tax, it makes it fairly straightforward to accommodate new income tax years. So for example, going into 2027, if the thresholds were to change, you're just changing these values here. And if the rates were to change, you're changing the values here. And then you reference the income for 2027. Another big advantage of the Lambda function over the let function and an inline formula is that if you use the formula throughout your spreadsheet, instead of having a copy of that formula in each cell, you now have a central location of the formula. If you change the formula up in the name manager, that change is automatically reflected in all cells that reference that function. The Lambda function reinforces a main programming principle of don't repeat yourself, abbreviated DRY. Dry emphasizes using reusable, modular, and maintainable code by having logic in a single, unambiguous place. In summary, both the let and lambda functions increase readability of formulas. The lambda function additionally provides a way to avoid repeating code. Okay, back to the original video. All right, so those are the built-in functions. Now some techniques, the use of these functions. Here's the index, how it's typically used to reference. In this case, let's say Microsoft. You want to search a particular column for Microsoft, and then based on, let's say here you're searching column A, but you want to bring back results in column C. This is how you do it. But newly introduced function XLookup does the same thing. It's much more straightforward in terms of how it works. So in this case, we're searching for Microsoft, searching in column A, and then we bring back the value that's actually in column C. Okay, next, if you want to count the number of non-blank cells in a column, you can't just use the count A function, because count A considers any occupied cell as being non-blank. This means a cell with a formula that resolves to blank is still considered to be non-blank. What you have to do is subtract off cells that are blank that count A thinks are occupied. So what you end up with is the count A function minus this formula that counts cells with formulas that resolve to blank. Okay, to find the first row in a column that's non-blank, this is the best way to do it. And then to find the last row, this is the best way to do it. Okay, next is an example of using SumProduct that can be very versatile by using this double Unary operator. Really, the first one is what turns true false into 1 0, but it turns it into -1 or 0. So then you got to put a minus sign in front of it to make the -1 1. But this just shows you that you can avoid using arrays like this formula and use the SumProduct instead. Since this video was originally recorded, another very powerful use of the SumProduct function is shown here. We're actually finding the last occupied row in a column that is not a formula. What it does here is it takes several array, multiplies them together, but then it takes the max of that all inside of the SumProduct function. So the way the SumProduct essentially works like this, it does an operation inside an operation, SumProduct, and the operation we're doing internally is the product, and then doing essentially the sum, but now a max. Another useful function to be aware of is essentially an IfBlank equivalent. Typically that's written like this, but a more efficient way to write it is take advantage of the if-error, and then you do a 1 divided by 1 divided by what it is you're putting there. So this works for a numeric value. If there is no numeric value, put a blank. But if there is, then this double division here will be successful. Next, in order to determine the number of occurrences of a string within another string, you can use this technique of calculating the length of the string and then substituting the value you're interested in with a blank, and then subtract off the shorter length of string to get the total number of occurrences of that value, in this case z. Okay, next talk about distinct values. If you want to get the number of distinct values in a particular column, use this formula here. Actually a very ingenious formula. I suggest you take some time analyzing it, but it does give you in a very unique efficient way the number of distinct values in a column. Next formula, you would put in an adjacent column to the column that you're wanting to determine distinct values, and just copy that formula down through each cell, and it would end up identifying the distinct values in the column. But a much better way to do that, we'll be talking about later on, is this function provided by Polaris called DistinctSort. Or you can even, if you don't want it distinct but still do a sort, you can do the SelectionSort. So that leads us right into the next discussion, is with alphabetizing. Well, I'm not going to go through a lot of detail of how you could alphabetize values in a particular column, because it's better to use this Polaris provided function called SelectionSort, or if you just want to alphabetize the distinct values in that column, use this DistinctSort. Make note that Excel ranks numbers and text separately, which complicates alphabetizing. Alright, next topic is VBA built-in functions. And there's a lot of comparable functions that we found here on the Excel side that you can use in VBA, namely uppercase, lowercase, character, but notice there's no A here, whereas if you're working on Excel, it's the car has an A in it. Format is similar to text, formatting text. To calculate the number of non-blank rows, you can use this count. Very powerful function called split. And then you got round. In string is very similar to search or find. Replace, similar to the replace that you had in Excel. Is numeric, and then an inline if statement. You also got message box, an input box to gather input from a user, lower bound and upper bound of arrays. Another thing you should recall is that when you can call Excel functions from within VBA by prefacing the function name with either WorksheetFunction or Application. Now, if you use WorksheetFunction dot and then the name of the function, let's say int, if there wasn't an error, you would get an error. But if you use application dot in the name of the Excel function, you have the option of being able to handle the error right there in line. And you would do that by using WorksheetFunction dot if error. But if you don't preference, if you say application.int and you don't put it inside WorksheetFunction.Iferror, then you'll just get an error, just like you would if you just used WorksheetFunction dot. All right, next I'm going to talk about some VBA techniques that you can use in efficient ways. If you want to get the number of occurrences in a string, you can use this U-bound and split combination and give you the number of occurrences. Or you could just use the WorksheetFunction dot substitute and use the approach that we discussed, namely here in the Excel built-in functions. Okay, another thing to keep in mind with when you're working in VBA is that to handle errors that may come up, you need to put it there on error and then reference usually a label, something like on error, and then you can throw up a message that specifies the error number and then an error description. Okay, another thing to keep in mind is if you're interested in knowing if something changes within a range of cells, and you only want to know if a single cell has changed within that range, you would include this AND condition, which would count the number of rows and columns and see if it's just one cell that's changed. But this is checking that specific range is a little more involved than you think, because of you have to do a not operation, because really all you can tell is whether nothing has changed within a range. But you want to know if something has changed, so you have to do the not of nothing. Alright, since this video was recorded, also has some other VBA techniques I want to discuss. One is about the last row in a column, and if you're doing that in VBA, you use this expression here with dot row on the end of the range. If as we just talked a little bit earlier about this formula up here, using SumProduct, this example here is using a VBA function called Application.Evaluate, where you can embed an Excel formula as a parameter in the evaluate function call and evaluate the entire formula. So even though it's a fairly complicated formula, you can have it evaluated here in VBA. So that's quite a powerful VBA function to keep in mind. Okay, now we're going to transition to talk about Polaris provided functions. And this first group of functions provided by Polaris that we're going to talk about are just kind of general functions. First one here is column number, so you can specify a column letter and it'll give you the number. So for instance, if you put in the letter B, it would come back with 2. The letter D would come back with 4. Column letter, just the opposite. You put in a column number, let's say 3, and it'll come back with C. Background color, you can specify a cell and it'll give you the integer value for that background color. Get red, green, blue, it'll return this text field here of exactly the values for red, green, and blue that make up that cell's color. Chart scale allows you to specify a chart name and then scale the X and Y axis. You can see here that it returns this string here. UpdateTime just simply invokes the now function, but what you typically want to do when you first open a spreadsheet is call that function and place the current time, date time, in a cell, and then whenever you want to reference roughly the current time, just reference that cell. That'll prevent a recalculation of that value for date time on every calculation. Random, similar kind of thing. There is a rand function provided by Excel, but it's volatile. So this function also has the additional benefit of not being recalculated. It gets calculated only when it's called. But it also does even more randomization than the rand function. The rand function, you can close your spreadsheet down, reopen it, and get the exact same sequence of random numbers. Whereas this Polaris provided random function, you close the spreadsheet down, open it up again, you won't get the same sequence of random numbers because it's seeded with the system time every time that you call the random function. Alright, some other functions that are useful is the maximum value in an array, minimum value in an array, the mean value of all the values in an array, standard deviation of values in an array. And then important function here is provided by Polaris called TransposeArray. Excel does provide a transpose function for VBA, but it's got some issues with blank cells appearing in the array itself and causes the transpose to function to error out. So this TransposeArray provided by Polaris handles blank cells. Some other functions are last row and column. We've already discussed that there are some built-in ways or techniques that you can compute the last row and column. But this just gives you a very explicit way. You can specify the exact worksheet, or here's the starting row, ending row, what column, and it'll tell you exactly where the last non-blank row is in that particular column. DistinctSort and SelectionSort, we've already discussed those a little bit, but they should be used instead of more elaborate techniques that typically are used by if you just use built-in functions or VBA provided functions. Since this video was originally recorded, there are now 7 more Polaris provided functions. First one here, the indirect trigger, similar to the native Excel indirect function. So for here, additional parameter is provided called the trigger. So the string you would normally put into the indirect function goes here, and then you are explicit with which cell you want to, or range you want to cause this function indirect trigger to be recalculated. So the big difference between this Polaris provided function and the indirect native function is the native function is recalculated on any change in the spreadsheet, whereas this function you can specify. Now if you have more than one range, you can use the choose command. The next new function is called IfBlank. This replaces the use of an inline if statement, IIF. If you're just checking for a blank, so you just type in as the first parameter the value you want to check for blank, and then if it is blank, what is it you want to replace with. So you either get back a non-blank value or a replacement for it if it's blank. If you just want it to remain blank, then you would put in a replacement value of blank, double quote. These other 5 new Polaris provided functions deal with worksheets. First one will tell you the current active worksheet's name, called ActiveTabName function. The next one, tab number, parameter is the sheet name, text name, and it'll give you the equivalent number worksheet. Excel numbers their worksheets from left to right, from 1 to n, so it'll tell you where it is going from left to right. If you know the tab number, you can use the tab name, and it'll give you the text name. And then these last 2 just tell you whether the worksheet or tab exists either by name, or if you know the index of the worksheet, it'll tell you whether that index exists or not. These last 2 functions probably should have been referred to as TabNameExists or TabIndexExists, but they use the word worksheet instead of tab. Okay, back to the original recording. These 4 functions here are system level functions. One is that allows you to determine if you've got an internet connection. If you do, then you can call this function to get the publicly facing IP address of the machine that the Excel is currently running on, and then get the computer name and then the username. All right, next set of Polaris provided functions and a subroutine deal with timing type functions, and all these functions are dependent on whether you've got a 32-bit or 64-bit environment that you're running an Excel in. Most anymore people have 64-bit, but not everyone, so you have to include this, or this code is included in the VBA code in this template spreadsheet. So it checks to see if you're on a 64-bit machine, and if so, it defines a variable called get tick count 64 versus if you're on a 32, it'll define a thing that's called get tick count. But this gives you the number of ticks down to the millisecond. So you can call it periodically, subtract the two values, and get the number of milliseconds that have elapsed between those two calls. Those variables are also used in a function called spin. So depending, again, if you're 32-bit or 64-bit, you have to have two different declarations of spin, because you spin a certain number of milliseconds. And it's just like the name implies, the spin function is a very tight spin. Compare that to sleep, which is a Windows function. Does somewhat the same thing, but it actually puts the Excel environment to sleep during that time. Whereas, like I said, spin is a tight spin, and Excel stays up and running during that whole time. There's also the ability to do a function called wait loop, and the big difference between a wait loop versus a spin is that in the wait loop you're waiting seconds, not milliseconds, and during that time that it's waiting, keyboard and certain kinds of events will be responded to, so it's not just a tight spin or a sleep, but it's a type of waiting that still responds to certain kinds of events. Now, another way to do this wait loop is you could use this Application.Wait and wait so many seconds here, but the big difference is this kind of waiting does not incorporate these external events that will wake it up out of the waiting that it's doing. And then last one, you really got to go to the detailed videos to refresh your memory if you don't recall what this timer event does, but it's a way to cause a specific function to be called at certain intervals. All right, the next set of Polaris provided functions anyway here have to do with pulling stock related information based on input value of a single ticker. For example, like Microsoft, so we can get what is the current price, what's the price change since yesterday, what's the last date of a trade, and I'm not going to go through all these, but you just see you can get various information about a particular ticker. The historic, you can also specify a date, how far back you want to go, and get the price on that end of day, and then the volume for that day. These functions here have to do with specific indexes, namely the SP 500 total return or the SP 500 itself, and you can get specify a date, and it'll tell you the value of the total return index or the SP 500 at the end of day on that date. This one here will take you back 3 months, and you can specify a ticker, and you can also specify an index. It'll give you the value 3 months ago, and here you can do 1 year. Now, the reason these functions are provided is they're through a service that doesn't charge at all, and so the values you would get here are the same values you get by using the historic and going back 3 months. It's just through a different service. These next two functions allow you to retrieve pricing information for multiple tickers at a time. Either get the current price of tickers or get the historic price of tickers, and then specify a specific date that you're wanting. You also specify the split number, because the data source that this information is coming from is only capable of pulling back so many tickers at one time. So you can specify as many tickers as you want in the ticker string, but you may have to play around with how you split it up, whether you want to get 10 at a time, 20 at a time. But the result of calling this function, the different results are concatenated together, and you're just presented one string for all these different groups of tickers that you're collecting from the data source. Okay, next set of functions we're going to talk about are these low-level web service functions. Typically, you would not call these functions directly. And just to give you an example of one, let's go look at this EOD Multiple Web Service. And looking at the VBA code, it's here. And then what it does is it takes tickers that you entered in, and then it goes off and calls a specific URL to get the required ticker. So for instance, we call that service with this URL string. You get back JSON formatted data for Microsoft, Apple, and Netflix. Now these other web service functions work in a very similar way. These up here call different URLs to get single stock results back from. But here's one data source called IEX, and the EOD data source. You can either get a single or current price or a historic price. Another data source called Polaris, and then a fourth data source called Alpha. Now EOD provides a way to get both current data and historic data for multiple tickers at a time, and IEX provides only for current multiple tickers. So 4 different data sources for single tickers, one of which gives you historic plus current, and then only 2 data sources for multiple tickers at a time, IEX and EOD, and then EOD gives you both for current and historic. All right, next we're going to talk about these very useful utility functions. And to do that, we're going to go right into the VBA code. And first one we're talking about is the tickers function. And what it allows you to do is specify a worksheet, a column number in that worksheet, a beginning row number, and an ending row number. And it'll then gather up from those cells individual tickers and concatenate them together into a single string. You can also specify another string that has additional tickers in it. So this allows you to nest the call to tickers and have multiple worksheets, multiple columns, different row starts, different row ends, and just continue to concatenate them all together through this nesting of calls to the tickers function. The CSV split out function is for comma separated values. It is assumed each row is delimited by a carriage return, and within a row, individual fields are delimited by a comma. What you do is you specify a string that has data like that in it, then exactly what row and what column you're interested in, and then this will bring back that specific value from that CSV string. Next function is the JSON parser, and this is a Polaris provided JSON parser. It's very short, very efficient. It has some limitations that are discussed in the detailed videos that I invite you to go look at if you don't recall what some of these limitations are. But for most times, most web services that you call, this JSON parser is sufficient. You just pass in the string you get back from the web service, what field you're interested in, what instance, and then if you don't find the value, you specify what value you would like returned if that field name is not found. If the JSON parser provided by Polaris is insufficient, there is another JSON parser called the full JSON parser, which is very involved, and suggests you watch the data access external data video around the 8-minute mark to learn more about that other full JSON parser. Okay, the last Polaris provided functions we're going to discuss have to do with tracing previous functions, and this is discussed in detail in the data access VBA techniques video. So if you need a refresher on these function calls, suggest you watch that video. But basically involves any of these functions that we've talked about up till now. They have in them a call to the debug caller function, and within that function it can decide what to do in terms of displaying information about where this function is being called from and what function is being called, things like that. If the spreadsheet is not set up to use debug caller function, it's important that the first statement in the debug caller function just be simply the exit function. Also, echo back is a function that you would use to assist in tracing. Instead of going through it here, again, suggest you watch this more detailed video if you need a refresher. In this last section, we want to talk about SQL statements that you may need to recall as you're accessing data directly from a database. SQL is basically 7 statements. 3 are data definition statements, 3 are data manipulation, and 1 is this retrieval or select statement. So the 3 definition statements are create, alter, drop. It's recommended in the video on database access is that you use select into to create the table, and then after you've done that, you can alter it to create a primary key, and then when you're done with the in this case a table, you can drop the table or the object here. Data manipulation is insert, update, and delete. Insert statement is similar to what we did here, select into, but when you insert, select statement comes after the insert. Up here, when you're selecting into, you put the select before the into. Update statement just shows you how you can update a particular field in an existing record in a table, and then how you can delete a specific record in a table. Okay, the select statement. This shows an example of a select using joins and then doing an order by. You can also look at that database video and discuss the group by and having. Some other types of queries you should be aware of is a subquery, which means you can have a query in the from clause and essentially make that query into a temporary table of which you can select from. And then a correlated subquery is a way to kind of conceptually think of it as doing an outer loop and an inner loop, and you're passing into the inner loop something from the outer loop. So in this case, we're passing in a student ID that we want to look for the maximum grade for that particular student, and then we just keep looping through all the students, and it eventually return back the maximum grade received by each student. Other things to be aware of when you're dealing with databases, that you can create views. Views can be used in place of tables and from clauses, and a view is just basically a stored select statement. And you can have stored procedures. And I won't go through the details of that now, but do remember that when you do create a stored procedure, you want to typically grant execution privileges, typically to the public. So also a couple of advanced things here that you want to keep in mind. One is the common table expression, and the other is the table value constructor. A CTE is essentially an inline view statement. We start off with a with, and then the name of the CTE, define it here, and then you can use it in subsequent statement. Table value constructor allows you to kind of transpose a table so that you can do things like average across different fields in the same row. And won't go through the details of it here, but if you need a refresher on that, you should go look at the database video. Hope you found this video helpful. Thanks for watching.